Now, skeletal muscles are considered an organ because they're made up of several different tissue types. We have nerves, blood vessels, connective tissue, and the skeletal muscle tissue itself. Now, it turns out that each muscle receives a nerve, artery, and venous drainage. And it also, skeletal muscles are controlled consciously by the nerves that supply every fiber. So every single muscle fiber in a skeletal muscle is connected to some kind of nerve fiber. And these nerve fibers are linked up with your nervous system that are ultimately controlled by the conscious brain centers. Now, contracting muscle fibers requires huge amounts of oxygen and nutrients, which explains why we need so many arteries and veins to supply blood flow, as well as carry nutrients and wastes to and from the tissue. And these wastes need to be removed quickly in order to, keep the skeletal muscle able to function normally. Now, each skeletal muscle is actually covered in a connective tissue sheath. And these sheaths are called epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. Epimysium is the sheath that surrounds the entire muscle, and it's made of a dense, irregular connective tissue that's tough. This can blend with the surrounding fascia to help, hold the muscle in position. Now, perimysium is a fibrous connective tissue that surrounds fascicles, which are basically groups of muscle fibers or skeletal muscle cells. And then endomysium means within, right? Within muscle. And it is actually made of a fine areolar type of connective tissue that surrounds each individual skeletal muscle cell or fiber to help nourish that fiber and supply it with nutrients. So looking at just a picture of muscle organization, we find that the entire muscle is surrounded by epimysium. Remember, epimysium is the dense, irregular connective tissue that packages the entire muscle together. And if you look at a cross-section of muscle, we see that each one of these circles here is represented by this one here, and this is actually called a fascicle. And a fascicle is essentially a bundle of muscle cells. So if you look within here, each one of these circles is actually a skeletal muscle cell, aka muscle fiber. So when many different muscle fibers are packaged together, we call that a fascicle, and it's actually perimysium that packages these fascicles. And it's many fascicles you find within the entire muscle itself, which is packaged by epimysium. And then each individual muscle fiber is surrounded by endomysium. And remember, endomysium, it's kind of represented here, which is basically just a areolar connective tissue that helps to nourish the muscle cell. You find that these skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. That's what's shown here in purple. And you can see they're striated. Now, in terms of muscle attachments, we say that skeletal muscles have an origin and an insertion. The origin is the attachment point of that muscle that is immovable, or at least less movable on a bone itself. Now, the insertion is the actual attachment of that skeletal muscle that attaches to a movable bone, right? So an example of this would be for a muscle in your brachium called brachialis. This one actually connects to the ulna, and because when the brachialis muscle contracts, it actually will pull on the ulna and causes the ulna to move in a manner that allows your elbow to flex. So it turns out the ulna will be the insertion point, because that's the movable attachment, whereas the origin of brachialis is the humerus, because this doesn't move when the brachialis contracts. Now, attachments can be both direct or indirect. If they're direct, we say that they're fleshy. In the sense, we say that the epimysium is fused with the periosteum of a bone or the perichondrium of cartilage. That way, the muscle pulls directly on that structure. If it's indirect, we say that there's actually a connective tissue wrapping that extends well beyond the muscle as a rope-like tendon or a sheet-like aponeurosis. So tendons are kind of more of a tube of connective tissue, whereas aponeuroses are actually a broad and thin sheet of tendon that link up with the muscle through connective tissue. So going back here, we see then that this would be considered an indirect attachment because of the tendon here that's attached to this bone. Otherwise, if this muscle were directly attached, then the muscle would be right on the bone itself, as it would be over here. Now, remember, the entire muscle is surrounded by epimysium. That's what packages it. And within that, we have fascicles, and each fascicle is surrounded by perimysium, and that each individual muscle cell is surrounded by endomysium. Now, if you zoom in here and look at each individual cell, you see that the cell itself is actually full of more tubes, and these tubes are called myofibrils. And myofibrils are basically, long cylindrical protein structures that are actually the things that are going to produce the contraction itself. Now, just looking at the organization, remember epimysium surrounds the whole muscle, perimysium surrounds the fascicle, endomysium surrounds the entire muscle cell. And what's interesting then is actually all of these connective tissue sheaths come together to form the tendon itself. So tendons are made of the epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium that actually surround and package the muscle. Where all those connective tissues come together, they converge to form the tendon, which is mostly just a connective tissue extension of the muscle that helps the muscle attach to things like skin, bone, or even other muscles.